He was 15 years old, not 16, not 17. 15, the age most kids are worried about passing their first driving test, getting their first job, figuring out who they want to be when they grow up. But Christopher Guerrero, the boy the streets called El Cachetes, wasn't thinking about any of that. At 15, he was running drugs through the streets of Mexico City. At 15, he was carrying weapons, extorting people, and flashing guns on social media like they were trophies. At 15, he'd already been arrested by Mexican authorities multiple times and walked free every single time. And at 15, he was shot 9 times on a street corner, 280 meters from his own front door, left dead next to a stolen motorcycle in the middle of the night. But here's where this story takes a turn you didn't expect. After he died, something strange happened. His family shared photos of him online, looking for sympathy, looking for remembrance. What they got instead was the internet. Within days, El Cachetes became a meme. His chubby-cheeked face, his guns, his Tony Montana obsession, his whole narco wannabe persona turned into jokes, into punchlines, into viral content shared millions of times across Facebook, TikTok, and X. A 15-year-old boy, dead. And the internet couldn't stop laughing. So today we're going to ask the question nobody else is asking. Who was El Cachetes really? Was he a dangerous criminal? A lost child? A victim of the culture that swallowed him whole? And what does it say about all of us that his death became entertainment? Stay until the end, because this story is darker, sadder, and more complicated than any meme will ever show you. This is the story of Christopher Guerrero, alias El Cachetes, the 15-year-old street kid from Mexico City who lived the narco life, died for a stolen motorcycle, and became a meme that the internet still hasn't forgotten. To understand El Cachetes, you first have to understand where he came from, because where you grow up shapes everything. And the place that shaped Christopher Guerrero is not the Mexico City of tourist guides and beautiful plazas. It's not the CDMX of museums and upscale restaurants. It's a completely different world. The Gustavo A. Madero borough, known locally simply as GAM, sits in the northern part of Mexico City. It's one of the most densely populated areas in the entire country. Millions of people, packed into neighborhoods built on top of each other, where the streets are narrow, the resources are thin, and the opportunities for young people are even thinner. The specific neighborhood where Christopher grew up was CACHETES, a working-class area in GAM, where residents live in small concrete homes, where corner stores and taco stands are the main economy, and where local criminal organizations have operated for years with near-complete impunity. This is not the cartel world of Hollywood movies. No mountain compounds, no private jets, no armies of soldiers in tactical gear. GAM is street-level crime, neighborhood-level crime, the kind that operates in plain sight because everyone is either involved, afraid, or simply too tired to fight it. The criminal cell that controlled Christopher's corner of the world was called Los Escamos, not one of the famous names, not the Sinaloa cartel, not CJNG. Los Escamos were a local operation, a small but violent cell running drugs, extortion rackets, and occasional homicides out of the Cocoyotes neighborhood and surrounding areas within GAM. And for a kid growing up in Cocoyotes with no money, no strong family structure, and no obvious path out, Los Escamos were everywhere. They were the ones with motorcycles, with cash, with status, with a kind of street respect that school could never offer. We don't have detailed records of Christopher's early childhood. We don't know exactly what his home life looked like, whether his parents were present, what his relationship with school was. What we do know is what the streets showed the world by the time he was 14 years old. A boy who had already decided what kind of life he wanted to live. And the life he wanted to live had a name: Tony Montana. If you want to understand the psychology of El Cachetes, you have to understand his obsession. Tony Montana, the fictional Cuban drug lord from the 1983 film Scarface, has become one of the most powerful cultural symbols in the narco world. Across Latin America, across the United States, in prison cells and trap houses, and cartel safe houses, the image of Tony Montana has been on walls, on tattoos, on phone cases, on clothing for decades. There's something about that character that speaks directly to young men with nothing. The immigrant who came from poverty and clawed his way to the top. The man who refused to bow down. The man who, even surrounded by enemies, stood his ground and screamed at the world. It doesn't matter that the movie ends with Tony Montana dying in a mountain of cocaine, shot from behind by the very people he trusted. Young men who idolize him never focus on the ending. They focus on the moment of power, the mansion, the throne, the line, "The world is yours." Christopher Guerrero focused on all of it. He renamed himself. He didn't go by Christopher on social media, didn't go by El Cachetes in his own mind. He called himself Chris Montana, a direct tribute to his idol, rewritten in Spanish to plant himself in the Mexican narco tradition. And then he took it further. At some point, the exact date isn't known, Christopher sat down and had someone shave his head, not just a normal haircut. He had the letters C and M shaved into his scalp. Christopher Montana, permanently visible, permanently committed. Think about that for a second. This is a kid, not yet 15 years old, who cared so deeply about a fictional drug lord that he put that fictional drug lord's initials on his own head. That's not just admiration, that's identity. That's a young person telling the world, this is who I am. This is who I want to be. And alongside Tony Montana, Christopher built a full spiritual and cultural identity around the narco world. He was devoted to Santa Muerte, the folk saint of death, widely venerated among criminal organizations across Mexico. He posted about Jesus Malverde, the so-called patron saint of drug traffickers, a Robin Hood figure from Sinaloa, whose image has spread across the narco underworld for generations. On social media, Christopher did what teenagers do. He performed his identity. He posted photos of himself with weapons, with cash, in poses that mimicked the cartel lifestyle he saw in videos, in movies, in the corridos that played on his phone. He wasn't hiding, he wasn't subtle, he was broadcasting. And journalist Carlos Jimenez, who goes by C4 Jimenez and hosts the crime reporting program C4 En Alerta, was watching. In 2022, Carlos Jimenez put El Cachetes on television. C4 En Alerta is one of the most watched crime news programs in Mexico City. Jimenez built his reputation by covering street-level crime in the capital, the local gangs, the neighborhood extortion rings, the young criminals that bigger news organizations ignore because they aren't famous enough. He covers the violence that hits regular people every day. And in 2022, he saw Christopher Guerrero's social media presence and decided to report on it. Jimenez aired the photos, the weapons, the posturing, the Santa Muerte devotion, the C and M shaved into the skull. He named Christopher publicly, connected him to Los Escamos, described his criminal activities, drug dealing, extortion, robbery. He put a face and a name to a teenage street criminal that the neighborhood already knew, but that the broader public had never seen. The report spread online. Christopher's photos circulated. His alias, El Cachetes, a reference to his noticeably chubby cheeks, started being attached to his image everywhere. And here's where something complicated happened, because when a teenager with a Tony Montana obsession and a gun gets put on Mexican crime television, two things happen simultaneously. First, law enforcement pays more attention. Second, and this is the part nobody talks about, so does the audience, and not always in the way you'd hope. Some people watching were horrified. A 15-year-old in a criminal gang, running drugs, carrying weapons. It was exactly the kind of story that sparked debates about juvenile crime, about the pipeline from poverty to organized crime, about what Mexico's justice system does and doesn't do with young offenders. But other people watching found it entertaining, found El Cachetes interesting, found something darkly amusing about this kid with the round face and the Tony Montana dreams playing gangster in the streets of Gam. That tension between tragedy and spectacle would only deepen after what came next. Here is one of the most important and most damning facts in the entire story of El Cachetes. Between 2022 and 2023, Christopher Guerrero was arrested by Mexico City authorities at least 4 times. 4 times. in less than 2 years, and every single time, he walked free. Mexican law regarding juvenile offenders creates a situation that authorities openly acknowledged was deeply frustrating. Minors cannot be incarcerated in the same way as adults. The sentences available are limited. The system is designed around rehabilitation, a system built for a different era, built before criminal organizations began systematically recruiting children as young as 10 and 11 years old, specifically because of those protections. The cartels and street gangs knew this. They knew that a 15-year-old caught with drugs would be processed and released. They knew that a 15-year-old caught with a weapon would face minimal consequences. They exploited this reality deliberately, using underage members as street-level runners and dealers precisely because the legal consequences were so limited. For Christopher, this meant that the system kept encountering him and kept releasing him back into the same environment, the same gang, the same corner. His arrests included multiple catches for cocaine possession, drug dealing, and other charges. After one of his arrests in October 2023, police found him in possession of 42 bags of marijuana and 82 doses of cocaine. He was with another individual identified as Lauren. Both were taken to the prosecutor's office. Both were released because they were minors. 1 month later, Christopher Guerrero was dead. The timeline is brutal in its simplicity. Arrested in October, released because of his age, shot 9 times in November. The system that was supposed to protect him as a minor and protect the public from him did neither. Violence in the street world rarely comes from grand strategy. It rarely comes from major territorial disputes or cartel-level power moves. At the street level, people die over small things. Disrespect, money, old arguments that fester, and sometimes a motorcycle. In the days leading up to November 23, 2023, Christopher Guerrero got into an argument with someone he considered a friend and criminal associate. The dispute was over a motorcycle. A stolen motorcycle, specifically. One they had taken together, and now disagreed about who it belonged to. This kind of argument happens constantly in the street world. 2 people commit a crime together, profit is supposed to be split, and then someone feels cheated, or someone claims ownership of something the other person also claims. And in a world where there is no legal recourse, no arbitration, no contract, disputes get resolved the only way available. The argument escalated. It moved beyond words. The associate reached out to people who had more firepower than Christopher. On the night of Thursday, November 23, 2023, a group came looking for El Cachetes. They went to his home first. He wasn't there. So they fanned out through the neighborhood, the same streets he had grown up on, the same corners he had worked, the same Cocoyotes neighborhood where everyone knew his name and his face. They found him 280 meters from his front door. Standing on a corner, apparently unaware that he was being hunted, Christopher Guerrero was located by the men sent to kill him. What followed was fast and merciless. At least 9 gunshots, 9 impacts. The 15-year-old dropped to the ground next to a blue motorcycle, possibly the very motorcycle, or one like it that had triggered the argument in the first place. When emergency services from ERUM, Mexico City's Rescue and Medical Emergency Unit, arrived on the scene, Christopher Guerrero showed no signs of life. Mexico City's security cameras, monitored by the C2 Norte Command and Control Center, captured 2 men fleeing the scene on a black motorcycle at high speed. The hunt for the killers began immediately. The response from Mexico City's Secretariat of Citizen Security was swift, unusually swift for a street-level homicide in GAM. Part of the reason was that El Cachetes was already known. Carlos Jimenez had put him on television a year earlier. His name was in police files. His face was recognizable, and the surveillance camera footage gave investigators a starting point. Within hours, a family member of the victim approached officers and provided information. The suspected killers were still in the area, located between Calle Piñar and Avenida del Trabajo in the nearby Ahuehuetes neighborhood. Police moved in. 5 men were arrested. Their names, as reported by Mexican authorities and crime journalists: Oscar Quiros, 44 years old; Santiago Tapia; Jose Eduardo Quiros, 20 years old; Jose Miguel Silva, 20 years old, and Arturo Garcia, 44 years old. Arturo Garcia was identified as the alleged mastermind, the intellectual author of the murder, the man who ordered it done. All 5 were taken into custody in possession of apparent drugs and a short firearm. The case seemed, in one sense, resolved. 5 arrests, a named mastermind, surveillance footage, a motive, a stolen motorcycle, a dispute that spiraled into execution. But the case of El Cachetes was far from over, because while police were processing their arrests, something else was happening online. Something that would keep Christopher Guerrero's name alive long after the court proceedings faded from memory. When journalist Carlos Jimenez covered the murder on C4 in Alerta, he included Christopher's social media photos. The same images that had made him briefly famous in 2022. The round face, the weapons, the Tony Montana poses, the C and M shaved into his skull, the images spread. And this time, the response wasn't just attention. It was mockery. Social media users, Mexican internet culture is particularly sharp-edged when it comes to narco content, began creating memes with Christopher's face. His chubby cheeks, which had given him his alias in life, became the visual punchline in death. His Tony Montana obsession, which he had worn as a badge of pride, became material for jokes about narco wannabes who get too caught up in the mythology. The specific irony that the internet latched onto was this: El Cachetes had built his entire identity around being a dangerous sicario, a real criminal, a hard street figure. And then he was killed, not in a major cartel war, not in a dramatic confrontation with rival gangsters, but over a stolen motorcycle by people he apparently knew, less than 300 meters from his own home. The gap between the identity he performed and the reality of how he died struck many internet users as darkly comic. Here was a kid who shaved Tony Montana's initials into his head, who posed with guns and preached loyalty to Santa Muerte, who called himself Chris Montana, killed over a motorcycle dispute by his own associates. Tanto brinco y al final con sus propios compas, the internet essentially said. All that posturing, and in the end, killed by his own people. The memes multiplied. His face appeared in edited images, in reaction posts, in content about betrayal and disloyalty. On Facebook groups dedicated to Mexican street news, his image circulated constantly. On X, his name trended multiple times. Even 2 years after his death in October 2025, his story went viral again. This time with AI-edited versions of his photos adding new layers to the already bizarre phenomenon. Family members who had shared his photos looking for sympathy found their posts flooded with mockery instead. Nobody remembers him as a good person, even though he was a minor. People insult him and ridicule him for thinking he was a real sicario, one comment circulating online read. And here is where the story demands that we stop and sit with something uncomfortable. It's easy to laugh at El Cachetes. Look at the photos, the chubby cheeks that gave him his name, the teenage boy trying to look menacing with weapons he barely knew how to hold, the Tony Montana obsession, a fictional character, a movie, used as the blueprint for a real life, the C and M shaved into his head like a kid who thought he was starring in his own Scarface remake. It's easy to see all of that and smirk. But hold on, because this was a 15-year-old boy, not a full-grown cartel operator, not a seasoned criminal with years of calculated choices behind him. A 15-year-old who grew up in one of the most economically marginalized neighborhoods in Mexico City, surrounded by a criminal organization that made violence and drug money look like the only available path, in a culture that glorified exactly the figures he idolized. He didn't invent the narco culture, he inherited it. The Inter-American Commission on Human Rights published a report estimating that approximately 30,000 young people in Mexico were working for organized crime at any given time. 30,000. And that number keeps climbing because the recruitment pipeline is relentless, because poverty is relentless, because the absence of opportunity is relentless. Because when a 15-year-old in Cocoyotes looks around and sees that the men with the motorcycles and the money and the respect are the ones running Los Eskimos. The calculus of that choice starts to make a terrible kind of sense. Mexican law released Christopher Guerrero from custody at least 4 times because he was a minor, but releasing him back into the same neighborhood, the same gang, the same environment, without any intervention, any support structure, any alternative, wasn't rehabilitation. It was just a pause before the next chapter. He was arrested in October 2023. He was dead by November 2023. The system processed him and let him go. And 30 days later, he was shot 9 times on a street corner. Was he dangerous? Yes. Was he involved in crimes that hurt people in his community? Yes. Is it possible that his presence on those streets caused real harm to real people? Absolutely. But he was also 15, and he was also failed by family, by neighborhood, by a justice system that had no real answer for him, by a society that created the conditions that make Los Eskimos possible in the first place. There's a version of this story where intervention happens at the first arrest, where a 14-year-old caught with cocaine gets placed in a program, gets connected to a school, gets some kind of mentor or structure or alternative. Not a get-out-of-jail-free card, a genuine attempt to redirect a kid who hasn't fully hardened yet. Mexico's juvenile justice system, overwhelmed and underfunded, almost never provides that. It processes, releases, and moves on. Christopher went through that cycle at least 4 times. 4 times he sat in front of authorities who had the chance to change the trajectory. 4 times the system shrugged and sent him back to cocoyotes. The memes don't hold any of that. The memes just see the punchline. The story of El Cachetes is not unique. That's the most important thing to understand. It's not a bizarre exception. It's not an outlier. It's a story that plays out in variations across Mexico City, across Guadalajara, across Monterrey, across Culiacan, across dozens of cities and neighborhoods, where organized crime has embedded itself so deeply that it functions as a shadow government, providing income, identity, community, and protection that the legitimate state simply doesn't offer. The recruitment of minors into criminal organizations in Mexico has been documented extensively. The Inter-American Commission report putting the number at 30,000 is likely an underestimate. Those are only the cases that make it into any kind of official record. The real number of young people working as lookouts, runners, low-level dealers, and increasingly as actual armed operatives is almost certainly much higher. What does the pipeline look like? It often starts younger than you'd expect. A 10-year-old in a high-poverty neighborhood is asked to be a lookout. Watch this corner, tell us if the police come, earn 20 pesos. That's real money to a kid whose family is surviving on almost nothing. Then they're trusted with small deliveries. Then with messages. Then with information. By the time they're 12 or 13, they're embedded. By 14 or 15, like Christopher, they're full participants. And the culture that glorifies this path is everywhere. It's in the music. Corridos tumbados, narco-corridos, the soundtrack of Mexican youth culture for decades, often celebrate cartel figures, the outlaw lifestyle, money and the danger and the freedom that the street world supposedly offers. Artists like Nathaniel Cano and Junior H have brought this aesthetic to hundreds of millions of streams, reaching young people in every corner of the Spanish-speaking world. The movies and television shows, Narcos, El Chapo, countless Mexican productions turn cartel figures into protagonists, into anti-heroes, into the most interesting people in the room. And then there's Tony Montana, the OG, the prototype, still on walls and tattoos and skulls 40 years after Scarface first screened. El Cachetes consumed all of it, let it become his identity, let it write his script. And he wasn't the only one. He'll never be the last one. While Christopher was going viral in death, another case was already making headlines. In October 2025, the same month El Cachetes was trending as a meme again, authorities in Tabasco arrested a 14-year-old known as El Niño Sicario. He was the alleged leader of a cell linked to kidnapping, murder, and drug distribution. When police approached him, he tried to fire a 9mm submachine gun at officers. It jammed. That malfunction is likely the only reason he is alive today. 2 kids, 2 different states, 2 different gangs. One story, repeated without end. The conveyor belt never stops. 2 years after his death, Christopher Guerrero's face is still circulating online. In October 2025, his story went viral again. Not because of new developments in the criminal case, not because of a meaningful conversation about juvenile crime and poverty, but because a new wave of memes was spreading across Mexican social media platforms. This time with AI-generated edits, with new captions, with his face dropped into fresh contexts for fresh laughs. His family's attempts to remember him, photos shared privately, turned public by the relentlessness of the internet, kept being swallowed by the joke machine. He wanted to be Tony Montana, the internet says, and laughs. But stop and think about what that really means. Not as a punchline, but as a portrait of how narco culture works on a young mind. Scarface came out in 1983. 40 years later, a 15-year-old in Mexico City is using it as his personal Bible. That's how powerful the mythology is. That's how deep the pipeline runs. The culture manufactures desire for that life faster than poverty, or police, or prison ever manages to extinguish it. Yes, he wanted to be Tony Montana. He was a 15-year-old boy from one of the poorest neighborhoods in Mexico City, who grew up surrounded by gang culture, who had no obvious alternative identity available to him, who reached for the most powerful symbol of street success that his culture offered him and shaved it into his own head. The meme version of El Cachetes is a punchline, a cautionary tale delivered with a smirk. Look at this kid who thought he was a gangster and got killed over a motorcycle. But the real version of El Cachetes is something harder to look at. He was born into a world that was already going to make his life very difficult. He grew up in an environment that offered him dangerous paths and very few safe ones. He was recruited, whether explicitly or through cultural osmosis, into a criminal organization before he was old enough to fully understand what that meant. He was arrested multiple times by authorities who had no real tool to stop his trajectory, and he died at 15 because of a dispute over a stolen object. Killed by people he knew in the neighborhood where he had spent his entire life. The chubby cheeks that gave him his name. The Tony Montana dreams that gave him his identity. The 9 bullets that ended it all. What El Cachetes leaves behind is not really a meme. What he leaves behind is a question. A question about a country, a city, a neighborhood, and a generation of young people being fed into a machine. And what happens when the machine is done with them. His name was Christopher Guerrero. He was 15 years old, and he deserved better than what the world gave him, and better than what the internet gave him after. The meme will keep circulating. His face will keep appearing in new edits, new captions, new jokes. That's the internet. That's how it works. But every time you see it, now you know what's actually behind it. A kid, a neighborhood, a system that had no answer for him, and a country still figuring out what to do about the tens of thousands of Christophers still out there right now, standing on corners, waiting for a way out that may never come. El Cachetes lived fast and died at the age when most kids are just starting to figure out who they are. He went from unknown street kid to local criminal to television exposure to meme to viral content, all before his 16th birthday. And somewhere in all of that noise, a real human story got lost. Subscribe to Inform Secreto to continue exploring the hidden stories behind power. Real stories told unfiltered, because what you don't see also controls the world. See you soon.